What is up, everybody? This is Josh, and I'm bringing you guys another TCG discussion video. Today, I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into the Maliss and Ryzeal archetypes and talk a little bit about how I like them for the game in general and also how to beat them and how to deal with them. Especially when it comes to Ryzeal, there is a lot more wiggle room in terms of how you can counter it, how you can act accordingly to its weaknesses and build your decks according to that. As a consequence of that, a lot more rogue decks and decks that don't have to play 24 hand traps are viable now, and that is something that in general I'm very excited about. And in today's video we're going to talk about why that is, or why I think that is, and I'm interested if you guys agree or not. As a baseline, I've already made an introduction to both Ryzeal and Maliss. Like, knowing the card effects and something like that is going to be like a requirement for today's video. I'm not going to go over every single card effect in this video. I've done that in the past. If you want to check those out, I've done it for both Maliss and Ryzeal. Without further ado, let's get into discussing these strategies in a little bit more detail. Before we discuss how to beat Ryzeal or what the best approaches are to counter Ryzeal, let's talk about a little bit why I think Ryzeal is a lot more healthy for the game than previous decks like Snake Eye and Yubel. Ryzeal introduces something really important to the game again, and that is a significant choke point in the form of Ryzeal Duo Drive. That is something that was severely lacking, I think, in decks like Snake Eyes and Yubel. The way it works against those kind of decks, if you hand trapped one of their starters, like a Snake Eye Ash or a Diabell Star, it was just a matter of they were one card away from just doing the full combo anyways, right? Of just achieving whatever they were trying to achieve, which was an auto win board most of the time, regardless of whether you had the first imperm or not, because they had the extender. In the case of Ryzeal, if you hand trap Ryzeal Duo Drive, there is no card in the Ryzeal deck you can just have to do what Duo Drive would have done, because Duo Drive just adds you 2 cards for free. No other cards in the deck do that, especially after you've obviously used your main starter already to get to the Duo Drive, right? This, in terms of game design, I feel like is super important, because I do think, besides the fact that like one card combos exist, like the non-existence of a real choke point in the Snake Eye deck, for example, I think that was the reason why hand traps were so necessary in such a large amount over the entire 2024, basically, because you just couldn't let that deck play, and drawing one hand trap wasn't enough consistently, because like they would just have an extender and push through it no matter what. Against Ryzeal, it is completely fine to draw one hand trap, and I can't stress enough how much I think that matters in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, because like that means you're not forced to play that many anymore, because drawing one hand trap actually isn't that hard. Also, even if the Duo Drive resolves, this deck still has a much lower ceiling than Snake Eyes or Yubel did. It's not even that bad if you don't have a hand trap against Ryzeal. It's just like their end board is going to get stronger, obviously, which is how it should be, honestly. If they go uninterrupted, their end board is pretty strong. If there is a hand trap, their end board gets weaker. The way it would normally go, you would hand trap the Duo Drive. They would have started with like Ice into Sword into X. They have more bodies they can use to still end on a detonator with 3 materials, which is like a respectable end board. But if you really look at what that end board does, well, it's a detonator plus whatever non-engine they have in hand, which is, once again, lower hand trap counts in general, means also that the Ryzeal deck is going to have less hand traps behind their detonator. So it's most of the time not going to be a matter of detonator plus 4 hand traps, usually like detonator plus 1 or 2. So like it becomes a playable game of Yu-Gi-Oh after. And I can't stress enough how much fun I had at Anaheim playing against Ryzeal decks. Like, it was just so refreshing in comparison to Snake Eye format. Fiendsmith obviously makes the deck a little bit more resilient to that one hand trap, right? Like, because you have another push, it gives the deck a little bit better grind game and just more things to do. However, even then, Fiendsmith cards in Ryzeal are still something that either you need to draw them or you need to sacrifice another rank 4 for it. Like, because you go Exiton into this, which means that instead of the Exiton, you're not making the Duo Drive right away, or you're not making a Baguska, or you're not making a Dweller. That means that at the end of the day, the Fiendsmith cards are also just like a extender in the Ryzeal deck, but still, unlike extenders in Snake Eyes, they don't let you perform the full Ryzeal combo anyways. If your Duo Drive gets negated, having a Fiendsmith Engraver won't really let you make up for that. Like, you will have an end board, but you're not going to have the same end board as you would have had if the Duo Drive resolved, if you get what I mean. By no means are the Fiendsmith cards bad in Ryzeal. They do make it more resilient, especially to cards like D-Barrier and Auto-Win cards, but like in general, Ryzeal is just much more manageable. The thing that people might ask is like, why is Ryzeal still that good then? Like, why is it the best deck if it has these sort of flaws? That's simply because those are flaws that Yu-Gi-Oh decks should have, and that most Yu-Gi-Oh decks have had in the past. It's just something that we're not used to anymore in 2024, when what we know now is like Snake Eye and Yubel just doing full combo or nothing, basically, which is not how it should be. We're just returning to basic things in Yu-Gi-Oh that should have always been that way. Let's talk a little bit about which kind of cards I think are good against Ryzeal and which kind of approach I like and would recommend for you guys, no matter what deck you're playing, because I do want to emphasize one other big thing that I like about Ryzeal is I don't think it gatekeeps a lot of decks out of the format, because what Snake Eyes and Yubel basically did were the only decks you could realistically play during those times were decks that could fit 18 or more hand traps and probably were able to either kill them immediately after they hand trapped them because you were scared of their follow-up, or you would need to establish full control over the game immediately, going first or second, right, after hand trapping them. Ryzeal is not that way. Ryzeal does not force you to draw that many hand traps, and that way a lot more decks become viable because you can break Ryzeal boards with one hand trap plus one talents. You can break Ryzeal boards with just board breakers, or even sometimes, if you get the right cards, with just engine. The thing that I think is the best approach against Ryzeal is to play a medium amount of hand traps, because A, there's still other decks in the format that you really want those against, like Ryzeal is not the only deck, and B, there's also some benefit to drawing, like I said, exactly one, because yes, you could beat the Ryzeal board with just board breakers, but it does get significantly easier if you do hit that duo drive. Like the existence of a choke point, it just incentivizes you to use a hand trap. I think the main hand traps for the Ryzeal matchup that are good are the ones that beat the duo drive and are also just generically good cards. So I think if your deck can fit like 9 hand traps, these would probably be the ones I would go for. Alternative options include cards like Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit, and Ghost Mourner and Moon the Chill, which I think are slightly worse than those 3 up here, but definitely still playable in the case you do want to go higher than 9. My opinion on Droll and Lockbird is that I think it is strictly worse than most of those cards, because the main purpose of Droll and Lockbird against Ryzeal is to just incentivize them to not make duo drive. I don't think it's a problem if my opponent gets to make duo drive if I can just negate it, and Droll and Lockbird is like a significantly worse card in any grind game scenario, like where you top deck it or where at any point you find it in your hand like turn 3, 4, 5. It's not going to be as good as like drawing another Effect Veiler, Imperm, Ash, Ghost Ogre, or even Mourner. And then obviously it goes without saying that like more specific cards like Dominus Purge, if your deck can play it, like the Fiendsmith deck, that card is phenomenal because it negates duo drive, sometimes even destroys. If you have Imperm beforehand, they won't have cards like Talents or Called By or even Cross Out for it because it's a trap card and they don't play it. I think Nibiru is a card that you can play specifically because it also covers Malice a little bit. The thing with Nibiru against Ryzeal is that it has to be paired. So if you're in a world where you are happy with just 9 hand traps or 12, I don't know if Nibiru should be one of them. Statistically, it's not that likely that you're going to draw Nibiru +1. If you still want to play like more than 12, I think Nibiru is fine. Those are the hand traps that I would recommend using, but I wouldn't recommend using too many of them, because what you will notice is that like drawing one is very good. Drawing a second one also feels nice sometimes because of 2 reasons. What you can do is you can try to hit their first starter and just hope they don't have an extender, which is not super unlikely. Or you can also wait and see if they have Cross Out or Called By, which are very commonly used cards at the moment. So something like Imperm and a Ghost Ogre can be nice, because if they go for duo drive, they use the effect, you Ghost Ogre it, and then you see, oh, they have Cross Out for it or they have Called By, fine, I'll chain Imperm on the duo drive. If the first one just works on the duo drive, you can also just hold the Imperm for the detonator, which makes Imperm, I think, overall the best one, also paired with the fact that like Talents is going to be a very popular card in the upcoming format. In terms of these 2 cards, Hubolos and Purulia, I don't think they are mandatory at all against Ryzeal. I think they are completely fine to side deck. The only deck that I think it's reasonable to main deck those is in Ryzeal itself, because they are level 4s. If you have just Engraver into Lacrima, and then you can normal summon a level 4 to make duo drive, or starting with X Ryzeal and it gets negated, and then you have a hand trap to normal summon, those are fine scenarios. You can main deck them. You still don't have to, because the Ryzeal deck is not a deck that you need to draw a Molcharmy against. You can just actually beat it with regular lower impact cards. I would recommend, depending on what deck you're playing, like this is something that you're going to have to answer for yourself. How much non-engine can my deck fit? Say the number that your deck can fit is like 15 or something like that. Like a deck that plays a lot of engine, 25 engine is a pretty hefty amount, I think, in 2024. Play like 9 hand traps like Veiler, Imperm, Ash, and play Talents and pick another board breaker. I personally think Droplets is pretty versatile right now and pretty good against Ryzeal, because you can just hit the detonator in a very flexible way while also like dodging something like Imperm maybe on the way, while Droplet is also a useful card when you go first. I'm showing you Talents and Droplets, but there's like so many more things you can do. You can play Thrust packages in your main deck, because that's technically also fine when you go first if you play a trap for it like Blackout Laughs, or you can play cards like Ultimate Slayer. Super Poly can be okay, I suppose, if they they end on Detonator plus Duo Drive, or like Desiree plus Detonator, right? Both lights. That's pretty devastating. It goes without saying that D-Barrier is good against Ryzeal, but be aware that the Fiendsmith version has some outplay potential for it. You're still going to see this card in a lot of side decks, but I don't think it's mandatory. I think if you practice the Ryzeal matchup enough, I don't think it's 100% necessary to always floodgate them, but like you can still play it. Like, it's worth mentioning. All kinds of options available there. I do think no matter what deck I was using, I would always pick a split between hand traps and board breakers right now. I would highly recommend there to be some amount of hand traps and some amount of board breakers. Like if it was 15, I'd go 9 hand traps, 6 board breakers probably. If it was 18, I would go 9 and 9 or 12 and 6. If it was over 20, I would definitely go like maybe 12 hand traps, 8 plus board breakers. I don't think leaning into either of these too heavily gives you enough of a benefit right now. It's hard for me to understate how much that means to me to be finally able to like recommend these sort of like mixed pools of non-engine again. It makes me happy to be like, yeah, you can actually just hand trap someone once and be happy with that and then draw like a spell card, and that's also cool. I think that's a pretty exciting part about Ryzeal, and I think that's why it also doesn't gatekeep a lot of decks, because you're so flexible in terms of like high engine count, which non-engine, and so on and so forth. It's pretty dope, honestly. I'm looking forward to early 2025 format. Of course, Ryzeal is not the only deck in the mix though, so let's talk about a deck that is actually going second, sometimes a little bit harder to beat than Ryzeal, even though it is less powerful overall and less popular, and that's Maliss, of course. All the things that we've talked about with Ryzeal, Maliss is a little weird in some of these regards because of these guys. Well, mainly these two, but because of how Maliss works, if they start with one of their normal summons, the White Rabbit or the Dormouse, and they will have a set card, Maliss suddenly becomes very hard to hand trap, because technically this deck only has 6 normal summons and then the field spell as starters. Everything else, they need to do some weird combinations of cards, which makes the deck not super consistent overall. But the problem is the deck has a lot of really high quality extenders, so as long as they find a starter, they are actually hard to stop, and they actually do a lot of those things that I criticized earlier with Snake Eye and Yubel, where if you hand trap Dormouse, which is correct to do, if they have an extender, like if they have one of these two set, or if they have a Bestial, or if they have a Lure plus White Rabbit or the field spell or something like that, whatever combo they're going to do is probably very close to the full combo. So as a result, these cards that you are incentivized to put in your main deck, like Valor, Imperm, and Ash, they are risky against Maliss, because if you draw Imperm against Maliss, there's 2 outcomes. Either you hit their normal summon and they will just pass, or they will have an extender and it will feel like the Imperm did nothing. Of course, you can try to hold the Imperm for more valuable choke points. Maliss has not that crazy of a choke point though. The problem is that Maliss just has access to the trap cards in their combos. As soon as the trap cards are set by White Rabbit, Imperm just becomes very bad, because like they can always dodge it, and if you use it on summon of the White Binder, for example, they can still banish the White Binder and bring it back, basically reset it, right? So these cards, while they're not bad against Maliss, they're not reliable. It's kind of like how it feels to just have one Imperm against Snake Eyes. Sometimes that's fine and sometimes that's not fine. Absolutely not. So in that regard, Maliss is a little more critical and requires more, I think, attention and more like high impact cards in the side deck. Lancia and Chaos Hunter thankfully are available. At that point, you just don't have to play any mind games anymore. I feel like that's the nicest part about Lancia. Do you have a Bestial as an extender? Do you have one of the trap cards set? I don't care, because I've got Lancia, right? Nibiru is another one of those cards that if it's paired well, it can be really, really devastating. That is one of the main advantages, I think, of doing a main deck approach of like, let's say 12 hand traps and then maybe Nibiru on top, because then you have a realistic chance in game 1 going second against Maliss to just draw Nibiru, and that can be enough. It's also not always enough because Maliss has lines around it, but it can help. If your deck struggles with it, which a lot of decks do struggle against Maliss going second, I do recommend preparing your main deck more for Ryzeal, because that just seems like a more realistic thing to do, because you're not going to main deck Lancia, let's be real. And also statistically, like there is more Ryzeal right now than Maliss, so like it just makes more sense. Just side deck more specific cards for the Maliss matchup, like Lancia, like Chaos Hunter if you think Lancia is not enough. If you're playing a thrust package in your main deck because you think it's good against Ryzeal, which it is, you can also side deck a Sanctum for going first, so that you can thrust into Sanctum for Lancia and then tribute it from the field. Something like Nibiru, if it's not in your main deck, should probably also be in your side deck. So like that is the quote-unquote nice thing, and it's hard for me to call it a nice thing because Lancia is basically just a hard floodgate against Maliss, but because it can be so hard to interact with Maliss otherwise, it's a good good thing that this card kind of exists to like solve that problem sometimes, at least from the perspective of playing against Maliss. Obviously, when you're playing Maliss, you're really gonna hope they won't have Lancia. But I think overall, the chance that sometimes they will pass to one Imperm or one Effect Veiler, and then the bonus chance of them just sometimes not being able to play at all because the deck isn't that consistent, as well as like being able to side deck basically as many blowout cards as you want in the form of Lancia, Chaos Hunter, Nibiru, I think Maliss overall becomes manageable if you just practice the matchup. In terms of like beating Maliss just with board breakers, I think that's difficult because their end board is just so layered, right? With like Terahertz, sending a Spell Trap Negate, this card just being able to bring back the white binder at any point, which is going to banish some stuff out of your graveyard and then some stuff out of their graveyard, like the White Rabbit, and then the White Rabbit is going to set this trap card on your turn, and then this trap card is going to banish this to be activated, and then they banish another card, and then this comes back and they draw a card, and it's just very, very hard to beat this deck just with board breakers, but it's still not impossible. When I'm talking about Maliss like this, you might get the impression that it's like, oh, just another Snake Eye or another Yubel, that like going second, you're just gonna pray that your hand traps are enough or your high impact hand traps are there. While this deck's end board is very powerful, it is still not even close to the level of a Yubel end board. Even in some of those games where you don't draw the right hand trap, or you don't find the Lancia, or you have the Nibiru but they do a line that's like kind of okay against it and they still end on some stuff, it's way more beatable. If your hand is good, like an actual good hand, something like Talons, Starter, Extender, Droplet, whatever, right? Those kind of hands, they can win. They're not guaranteed to win, or they're not like super favored if you don't stop them at all, but it's playable. And I think that matters a lot. Whereas like, even if you draw Talons, Droplet, Starter, Extender against a full Yubel board, it doesn't matter, right? I hope this was interesting. I just tried my best to just ramble about the format a little bit, bring in some thoughts. Whatever deck you're playing, it doesn't have to be Ryzeal or Maliss, like any sort of rogue deck as well. I think you can benefit from these thoughts and put them into action with your own deck. I think you can apply it to whatever situation you're in, however much non-engine space you have. And obviously, it depends on how strong your deck is at pushing through boards with engine, because that is really something that's going to matter again. And I think that's really cool. Let me know your thoughts. Let me know if this was helpful at all. Let me know if I should keep doing these things when new formats are around. Make sure to subscribe to the channel if you liked it. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you for watching.